good afternoon. Thanks for being here, and thanks OTS for giving me the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon. So I had my doubts about this choice of a question. It's not going to be a science talk. And to many of you, maybe this sounds like a kind of a redundant and even a little bit of a silly question. We all know, we're all scientists, we're students of science, and we all know that science is really important for environmental protection. But looking at the news for the last couple of years, it seems that the intensity of the environmental crisis is worsening and worsening every day. And so this question, which has always been in my mind in some kind of, in general terms, we know that science is important for conservation, suddenly is taking a more of a personal significance. And so that's why I wanted to take the opportunity to share this space with us. I'm no expert at all in this field, and hopefully there will be time for input and questions at the end, and if not, later with beers, hopefully. So, yeah, so as Kyle said, I'm ecosystem ecologist and biochemist. I've worked in the Arctic tundra and in the boreal forest, a little bit in Central Africa, and now I'm based in Costa Rica, where my research centers in tropical forests, dry forest and humid forest. I'm interested in, I'm actually working on three questions that I'm interested in. One of them is the cycle of phosphorus in soils through ecosystems, mostly the cycle of organic phosphorus. And to this purpose, I use tools like nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy to identify these forms of phosphorus and better understand their bioavailability to plants. I'm also really interested in the sequestration potential of carbon in soils and the drivers that control the release of this carbon. And finally, right now, I'm managing a long-term forest fertilization experiment, which is located really close to La Selva. It's located at Earth University Forest Reserve, and it's the second longest running forest fertilization experiment in the world. It's been going on for 12 years. I'm collaborating there with my friend Silvia Alvarez, and there we hope to we're testing hypotheses, like fundamental hypotheses about the role of nutrients in ecosystem function, both above ground and below ground. So, anyways, so you're all familiar, if you've been looking at the news, you might be familiar with the fact that 2018 and 2019 was a year where lots of really scary reports were published. So, for example, if you read, the IPCC released this special report on climate change. Specifically, it was a report talking about the consequences of allowing global temperatures to increase by 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial average, pre-industrial averages, or even letting it to go above that, 2 degrees. And something that I noticed that's changed is that the tone of urgency of these reports that are made by hundreds of scientists. Now the United Nations, through this report, calls for unprecedented action on climate. And so here's just a small piece of this report. Pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban and infrastructure, and industrial systems. These systems transitions are unprecedented in terms of scale and imply deep emission reduction in all sectors. So basically, we have 11 years to get our act together and do something if we don't want to limit the risk of catastrophe, like extreme heat, drought, etc. Right now in Costa Rica, we're going through a drought, and one of our main agricultural regions, Cartago, has seen a 50% loss of its crops. So for countries like Costa Rica, that we don't have a very big science budget, we don't have a very big scientific community, having to do this is actually not easy. It's not easy for anyone, but for Costa Rica, it's especially scary. Another one of the news that was really shocking, and I know in science we're not meant to talk too much about emotions that are not curiosity or surprise, but sadness was an emotion that I felt a lot as a scientist in 2018. And this was a report published by WWF, the Living Planet report, and what they're reporting is that in the last 50 years there's been a 60% decline in the population sizes of many vertebrate groups, like amphibians, birds, fish, etc. The same IPCC report also warns us that if we are not able to curb increases in temperature by 2 degrees, there's a 99% chance that corals might disappear. As somebody who grew in the tropics snorkeling, corals the idea of a world without corals is really sad, and also the idea that the next generation might not see corals is quite saddening. And another one of these cases is the reports of massive insect decline. So a famous study in Germany that showed that 75% of all insect biomass had been lost in the last 30 years. And just recently this year, a mega review of this insect decline was published. And also note how the language that scientists use in specialized journals is also changing. This review highlights the dreadful state of insect biodiversity in the world, as almost half of the species are rapidly declining and a third are being threatened with extinction. And this other German study talks about describing the insect community as being decimated. So yeah, it's a lot to take in, at least for me. Dan Jansen and Willy Hauwaks just produced a paper that came out this year, and we don't have a lot of really good long-term data in Costa Rica, at least not like this long-term monitoring of insects. And so what this paper is about is an anecdotal account, because Dan Jansen's been in Costa Rica since '53 and Willy Hauwaks since 1978. So they have an anecdotal account of how they've seen this insect decline. And one of the anecdotes that he talks about was how in the 1970s it was really important to stop at gas stations in Liberia, and ask for your car windshield to be cleaned, because there were so many bugs that you couldn't drive at night without your windshield being completely smashed by insects. Or how they had to build little tents in his little house in Santa Rosa that is completely open, because otherwise they couldn't work at night with a 25-watt bulb lit for 2 hours. So the main topic running through this session is the future of tropical biology, and that's why I wanted to talk about this, because the future of tropical biology depends on tropical ecosystems being there. So this is nothing new, but I wanted to stress it again. So at the end of this paper by Dan Jansen and Willy Hauwaks, there is this amazing quote. This is a friend who sent me this paper. Thanks, Carlos Andi from Earth, for sending me this. The house is burning. We do not need a thermometer. We need a fire hose. And that message really hit home with me, because as scientists, we love explaining, we love describing, we love understanding the mechanisms. We thrive on this. This is what is so fun. You just want to know how the world works. But we are running out of time. So IPCC talks about 11 years. Does it mean that we have 11 years before serious environmental damage is happening? I mean, these papers that I just showed you are already showing that the damage is already happening. So this is gonna sound really tough, but if we don't do something, we're basically free riding on the people who are, and we don't have much time left. And I'm just talking for myself. I mean, I know there's many people here who have devoted entire careers to combining science and conservation here in the United States, all over the world. But I'm just like a regular scientist that is focused on biogeochemistry, and I haven't really seriously considered about, okay, we have this crisis. How am I going to redirect my career, and what am I going to start doing right now so that I'm just not doing what I've been doing my whole scientific life, basically. So this leads me to another question. Although there are lots of scientists doing lots of amazing things, there's also lots of scientists like me who are not doing much. I mean, we think that maybe by studying the forest or being good professors or telling our students about the need for action, maybe I'm doing my job. But in this fire hose scenario, that's not longer enough. So I read this paper and I wrote an email to Dan Jansen, and I was telling him, but I don't know, why is it? Maybe it's just that, scientists, we tend to be a little bit introverts. We love being in our lab. Maybe we just don't like talking to politicians or talking to the general public. It's so tiring. Maybe we just don't see ourselves as being able to really make a difference. And he didn't talk to me, but I could almost hear his voice saying, no, it's not that. It's just that you don't want to. Like, what? Yeah, you just don't want to. You don't want to do what it takes to make a difference as a scientist. And yeah, of course I knew it all along. He's right, at least in my case. Of course, this is just my experience. Everybody has a different experience, but we know what we need to do, and we don't want to do it. And part of the reason is that academia doesn't reward us for it. Nobody cares if we are talking to school children or if we're taking an extra afternoon to go and talk to, to somebody from the ministry, or those things have no value in academia. In countries where you have a really aggressive publish or perish culture, like the US or Europe, imagine, you're expected to publish, I don't know how many papers in high impact factor journals a year. Here, we don't have such a strong publish or perish culture, but we do need to publish. And here, our institutional funding structures make basic scientific research very difficult and very time-consuming. So even if we're going to publish less, we need to be really careful about our time because things take longer here. So we've also internalized ideas of what is valuable in academia, and that's basically publishing lots and publishing well. Not spending time with people or talking to people or doing all these other activities that won't really look so good on our CV. So basically, when we end up in a situation where it's so difficult to do good science that we carve out all activities that won't directly contribute to writing papers. And unfortunately, that means some of the activities that are most satisfying for our academic lives, having time to talk to students, having time to communicate with rural communities, having time to say what we're doing in Central American countries, that's especially important. We don't have a very strong scientific culture here, so more groundwork needs to be done for science to be strong here. So imagine that there is a change that happens within us, or there's a culture shift in academia, and all of a sudden we had more time or a better possibility to really start taking direct action to help the environment more. What things can we do? And I'm sure you all know this, but I'm still going to talk about it. And I'm going to talk from the perspective of a scientist working in Costa Rica, which is my experience and what I can talk about. First of all, I think it's really important that we figure out what information Costa Rica needs. Can we be more proactive about generating the information that Costa Rica really needs for management and for better protection of its resources? We need to figure out what information is needed for the management of specific places. We have a national treasure. We have our protected area network managed by CNAC. We don't have government laboratories like Argonne or, for example, in the US, and we don't have like a forestry service or United States Forestry Service or USGS or whatever. So it's almost like the scientific information that is needed for these areas is generated by us, by academics in public universities. This has been thought of before. I have colleagues who have tried to talk with CNAC and know what their needs are. It's not easy. It's not a well-established channel of communication, but we should work on it more. We also need to think about long-term monitoring of biological and environmental variables. It's a little bit late, but it's still necessary. Imagine that with the current financial crisis that we're in Costa Rica, ICE, our National Electricity Institute, in order to save money, eliminated 40% of all of its automatic meteorological stations last year. That's like, it's not like they've eliminated eddy covariance towers or flux towers. They've eliminated measurements of temperature and rainfall because there's not enough money. So how can we adapt to climate change if we can't even know for sure what's going on with rainfall? So I am putting this as an example. I love this model, the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON, in the United States. And wouldn't it be amazing to have something like this in Central American countries? Number two, we need to improve our national scientific production. And one of the things that I love most about OTS, I never did a PhD in OTS, and I also didn't do an OTS course. I came to OTS later in life as a coordinator for different courses, and then as a researcher at Palo Verde National Park, and also taking students to La Selva. And OTS, one of the things that I love about OTS is that one of the problems that we have here in Costa Rica is that we are not very international. Research groups do not have very strong international links, and OTS brings the best of the ecological scientific community to our doorstep. We are 2 hours away at La Selva to go and talk to some of the best scientists. We can have important discussions, maybe share students, have projects together, and that must go on. That cannot go, because the science community in Costa Rica needs this kind of exposure and challenging conversations, etc. So I lost track of time. Can you? Okay, go. So, okay, this is Estado de la Nación, a very comprehensive study of the state of science and technology in Costa Rica. It was published in 2014. And this is just a few of the main challenges that we have if we want to bring up to speed the quality of our scientific production. Costa Rica only invests 0.57% of its GDP in science, compared to like 3.15% in Japan, and it's even lower than Latin America average, which is 0.78%. So it's a very low investment in science, and we have to be able to work with that. Another things that these studies found is that we have fragile research communities. Our networks in our different research groups are not very strong. We suffer from academic inbreeding, which means that it's hard for us to hire people from outside. We tend to hire the same people that were trained here. We have low redundancy of scientific personnel. We have low productivity compared to other countries. And we have weak participation in international research networks, and that's why I think that's one of the main values that OTS brings to me as a scientist here. And we also have low interdisciplinarity. And the point of putting all these negative things, it's not being negative, it's just being honest about what we have and how we can improve, and how OTS can help us. We also suffer from brain drain. We have a lot of people doing PhDs abroad in some of the best universities in the world, and they won't come back because the working conditions here are not attractive enough. Our labs are sometimes deficient in equipment, although I have to say I'm really impressed by some of the labs here at UCR and UNA, so I'm not sure I agree so much with that report. And interestingly, if you compare the amount of money that we spend on science, we're actually less productive than some countries. So Chile only invests 0.37% of its GDP in research and development, and they have a much higher productivity than us. So it's not all down to money. And finally, to finish with this sad but important list, of the little money that we have, very little of it is dedicated to the natural sciences, which would be the type of ecological information that we need to have better environmental management. This is a good book. I bought it this week. It's by one of the most productive researchers in this university, and it has some nice insights about how to make UCR a better place, and it also applies to other universities in the country. So this is just a very rough, I just thought it would be interesting to show you this. I just typed Costa Rica in the topic field in the Web of Science, the IC Science Citation Index, and then I used the Analyze feature. Seriously, I mean, there's problems with this, but I looked at some of the papers and I think it's like a rough indicator. So there were 12,000 papers that either are about Costa Rica, are somehow related to Costa Rica. As you can see here, the vast majority of research published related to Costa Rica is in the environmental sciences, either in ecology, zoology, plant sciences. So this just goes to show the importance of thinking about the future of tropical ecosystems and of the disciplines. Of all the author affiliations, Universidad Costa Rica is the single institution that has the highest number of affiliations, but there's also lots of other categories that I'm not showing because it would be, you couldn't interpret this square, but all these numbers should add up to 12,000. So Universidad Costa Rica, lots of people, and then you can see a lot of international institutions, most of them from the US. And if you look at the funding sources, unsurprisingly, some of the institutions that fund most of the research that is done about Costa Rica is the US, the NSF, National Science Foundation. And this is interesting, but it's also a message that is important for us Costa Ricans, and is we need information generated specifically to our needs for management. And many of these questions that we need to answer won't be funded by NSF or won't be funded by other countries because, you know, they're like our own information needs that people at SINAC need or that people at other places need. So if we want to make sure that scientific productivity increases so that we can generate the necessary knowledge to manage our resources better, we're going to need to spend some time to try to fix this system and either get the government to increase how much money it spends on science or make the scientific structures more efficient so that we can do our job better with less money. we also need more scientists interacting with government. Already a lot of us who are here are involved with government in one way or another, with like comisiones especiales and things like that. But another problem here in Costa Rica is that very little hard data is used for environmental decision making. So we don't have evidence-based decision making, and we need to change that. One example, Costa Rica, I don't know if you've heard about it, but Costa Rica recently released a decarbonization strategy. It even made it to the New York Times. It's been hailed as an example for the rest of the world. It's Costa Rica's commitment to have a carbon-free economy by 2050. There is a scientific advisory committee on climate change, which I am a part, and they gave us this to read 2 weeks before its official release, so we couldn't really have a say in changing it. And one of the things that really struck me is that this plan has almost no data and has almost no specific greenhouse gas reduction targets or metrics to measure progress. So it's not really a plan, it's like a concept note, or perhaps a big PR operation. It's really good that the Costa Rican government is making this effort, but it's a bit thin on science. So we need also to change that. And just to finish my talk, this you also already know. In Costa Rica it's a little bit different because we don't have science communication degrees, we don't have such a strong science culture. We don't even have a scientific journalism branch in our journalism school here. So we need to make sure that we speak up, give more opinion and become more visible to the general public so that we can actually start telling people what science is about, telling the government, and participating more. And we also need to make sure that more scientists and more people with science background are able to participate in environmental decision making. So there is this strange cultural attitude in this school, and I'm sorry I'm saying it like this, but sometimes students have the feeling that if they don't do research in biology, they somehow failed. So they graduate from this school and they don't have a very clear panorama of what are the other options to have successful careers outside of academia. And we need to change that, because if more people are able to find jobs using their biological skills in jobs that are more environment related, then we basically have this ally of people who are literate in science and can push for environmental protection in many different ways. That already happens to a certain extent, but it can improve. And my last slide, we need more diversity in science here in Costa Rica. We all know that diverse environments are more productive and more ideas. We are up to some pretty difficult things that we have to solve, so we can't afford to lose brilliant minds because of discrimination of any kind. And with this, I would like to thank you for this.